Have you ever heard of an entire town agreeing to share one child, so no single family would ever have to explain where he came from? Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, real stories that uncover what was hidden, consider subscribing. Now let me tell you how this happened. In the quiet folds of a small American town that barely appeared on maps in the early 1960s, there was a child everyone recognized and no one officially belonged to. The town itself was unremarkable. Two churches facing opposite ends of the same dusty road, a post office that closed before sunset, a single grocery store with a bell that rang every time someone entered, and rows of modest wooden homes that carried the smell of cooked dinners and unspoken routines. People here knew each other's schedules, their histories, their grudges, and their silences. Nothing ever happened without being noticed, and yet for reasons that would only surface decades later, this town collectively chose not to notice one particular truth. The child arrived without ceremony. No public birth announcement, no proud father waiting in a hospital corridor, no mother photographed with flowers and congratulations. Instead, the child appeared quietly, as if slipped into the town's life between seasons, carried not by celebration, but by agreement. People later said the baby stayed first with one household, then another, sometimes a few weeks, sometimes months, sometimes long enough for neighbors to assume the child belonged there permanently, until one day, without explanation, the crib would be empty, and the child would be seen on another porch, being fed by different hands, called by the same name, but never claimed as anyone's own. What made the situation stranger was not the movement of the child, but the way everyone spoke about it. If asked directly, each family had a perfectly reasonable answer. "He's my sister's boy, just staying with us for now. She's helping out while his mother works. It's temporary." The explanations were neat, unchallenged, and delivered with a calm confidence that discouraged follow-up questions. Over time, the town developed a shared language around the child, phrases that softened reality and disguised permanence as convenience. Teachers accepted the lack of enrollment paperwork. Doctors treated the child without asking too many questions. Church records remained oddly incomplete. The town didn't argue about who the child belonged to, because belonging in this case was not the point. What mattered was that everyone understood their role: feed the child when he was under your roof, clothe him decently, keep him quiet, and never ask what came before or what would come next. As the years passed, the child grew aware of the pattern, though no one ever explained it to him. He learned early not to ask where he would sleep next month. He learned that birthdays were modest and inconsistent, sometimes remembered, sometimes forgotten. He learned that photographs were rare and that family albums never seemed to include him beyond a single year at a time. Yet he was never abused, never neglected in obvious ways. That was the town's quiet defense. "We took care of him," they would later say. And in a narrow, practical sense, they were right, but care without identity is a fragile thing. A child can be fed and clothed, and still grow up unsure of where they end and others begin. He learned to read faces instead of calendars, moods instead of plans. He learned to pack quickly. He learned not to leave toys behind, because toys belonged to houses, not to him. Outsiders rarely noticed anything unusual. If a visiting cousin or traveling salesman asked why the child lived in different homes, the answers came smoothly, rehearsed, but never identical enough to suggest a script. The town was skilled at partial truths. Someone always knew just enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing the core. And at the center of it all was an unspoken understanding that the truth, whatever it was, carried consequences too heavy for anyone to bear alone. This was not a secret held by one person. It was a secret distributed carefully across many, diluted through shared responsibility. No single adult could be blamed, because no single adult had made the decision. It had emerged collectively, quietly, the way mold grows in a damp house when everyone agrees not to open the windows. By the time the child reached adolescence, the arrangement hardened into routine. He spent holidays with different families each year. Sometimes he was introduced as a nephew, sometimes as a distant cousin, sometimes not introduced at all. Legal documents were avoided whenever possible. School forms were signed by whoever happened to be housing him at the time. Medical history was vague. Questions about parents were deflected with humor or gentle irritation. And still, no one intervened. No authority stepped in. No neighbor broke the pattern, because to do so would require admitting that the situation was not temporary, not accidental, not harmless. It would require naming the lie, and naming it would mean deciding who the child really was, and more dangerously, who had created him. The truth was sealed not in a single locked box, but in many small ones. A priest's memory, a midwife's silence, a clerk's missing file, a ledger with a torn page. Each person held a fragment, and each fragment was meaningless on its own. Only when assembled would the full picture emerge. And for decades no one dared to assemble it. The child grew into an adult, carrying an absence he could never quite define. He belonged everywhere and nowhere, shaped by many households, but claimed by none. And the town continued its life, convinced that silence had protected everyone, until the day a forgotten record surfaced, and the lie they had all shared began to collapse under the weight of its own longevity. The first crack in the town's long-held silence did not come from anger or confession or guilt. It came from routine, from paperwork, from a moment so ordinary that no one present realized they were standing at the edge of something that had been carefully buried for more than 30 years. The child, now a grown man, had returned to the town not out of nostalgia, but necessity. His life elsewhere had stalled in ways that forced him backward, toward the place that had shaped him without ever naming him. He came to settle a legal matter, something small and procedural, something that required proof of identity beyond memory and shared recognition. A birth certificate, a document most people had never thought twice about. For him, it was a blank space that had followed him since childhood, an absence he had learned to navigate without complaint. The county office was exactly as he remembered it. Low ceilings, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, the smell of old paper and disinfectant. The clerk behind the desk was new, young enough not to recognize him, young enough not to carry the weight of the town's unspoken agreements. She typed his name into a computer, paused, frowned, and typed again. Then she leaned back, squinting at the screen, scrolling further than she expected to. "That's strange," she said. Not with suspicion, but with mild confusion. The kind that comes when a system doesn't behave as it's supposed to. She disappeared briefly into the back room, returning with a thin folder that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. Inside were fragments, not a full record, not an official file, just enough to suggest that something had once been filed, then altered, then quietly abandoned. The man watched her expression change as she read. Clerks are trained to remain neutral, but neutrality falters when records contradict themselves. The folder contained a birth entry without a registered mother, a father's name written once and crossed out, and a hospital reference that no longer existed. The dates matched, the location matched, the child was him. But the record had been interrupted, left unfinished, as though someone had begun to tell the truth and then stopped halfway through, realizing the cost of finishing it. The clerk hesitated before speaking again, her voice careful. "This isn't complete," she said. "It looks like it was redirected." Redirected was a gentle word, a bureaucratic one. It did not capture the intention behind the act, or the number of hands required to make it happen. Word of the visit traveled faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, people who had not spoken to the man in years were suddenly checking in. Old neighbors asked how long he planned to stay. A former teacher mentioned running into him by chance. An elderly woman who had once housed him for nearly a year invited him for coffee, her voice warm but tight. No one mentioned the county office. No one mentioned the file. But their concern had shifted subtly, from polite interest to quiet alarm, because records, unlike memories, do not forget. And once one piece resurfaces, it invites others to follow. A hospital ledger, a church registry, a tax document, each one a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the story the town had spent decades maintaining. The man began to notice the pattern only after it was already in motion. Conversations stopped abruptly when he entered rooms. Names were avoided. Questions were deflected. He had lived inside these behaviors as a child, but as an adult, he could finally see them for what they were. Not kindness, not protection, but control. The town had not simply cared for him. It had managed him, distributed him, placed him where he was least likely to be questioned, least likely to force a decision about responsibility. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this arrangement had required coordination. Someone had spoken first, someone had proposed the solution, and others had agreed. Not enthusiastically, not proudly, but practically. The lie had been framed as mercy, as necessity, as the least harmful option available at the time. Late one afternoon, he visited the church archives, a small room behind the sanctuary that few people remembered existed. The records there were older than the town's current leaders, kept in heavy books with brittle pages and fading ink. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he needed something that didn't rely on people's willingness to remember. A volunteer helped him at first, then quietly excused herself when she saw the year he was searching for. Alone, he flipped through baptism entries, confirmations, marriages, and there it was. A single line written smaller than the rest, squeezed between two unrelated entries. His name, a date, and beside it, a notation that made no sense at first glance. Not son of, not born to, but a phrase that implied custody without origin, care without authorship. The realization did not arrive as anger. It arrived as exhaustion, a deep, bone-level fatigue that came from understanding that the truth had never been lost. It had been negotiated. Every family that took him in had participated in the same agreement. To provide shelter without explanation, to accept responsibility without ownership. They had raised him together, not because they loved him collectively, but because none of them could afford to claim him individually. And now, with one incomplete record exposed, the balance was shifting. People who had once believed silence was protection were beginning to fear that it might soon become evidence. The town had survived on shared forgetting. But forgetting only works as long as no one insists on remembering. By the end of the week, the man understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before. The question was no longer who his parents were. The question was why so many people had worked so hard to ensure he would never ask. And somewhere in the town, perhaps in a drawer, perhaps in a mind that was growing older and less careful, there was a complete version of the story. One that named names. One that explained why a child had been divided among households instead of raised in one. And once that version surfaced, the town would have to confront not just what it had hidden, but what it had normalized for an entire generation. The man did not set out to expose anyone. By the time he understood what the records were hinting at, he had already learned that this town did not respond well to confrontation. Truth, when introduced too quickly, had a way of being absorbed, softened, and eventually dismissed. People here did not deny outright. They redirected. They reframed. They waited for time to dull the edges. So instead of asking who his parents were, he asked a different question, one that felt safer, less accusatory, and far more dangerous in its implications. He began to ask who had decided, who had been the first to speak, the first to propose that a child could be raised by many and claimed by none. Because such an arrangement does not form naturally. It requires a voice, a suggestion, a moment when someone looks at a problem and chooses a solution that spreads responsibility thin enough to disappear. The answer did not come from an archive or a ledger. It came from a woman nearing the end of her life, someone the town had quietly reclassified as harmless with age. She lived alone now, in a house that smelled faintly of dust and antiseptic, her world reduced to a few rooms and a careful routine. She had been present at the beginning, though she had never been central enough to draw attention. A nurse once, or perhaps a midwife. Her role had shifted depending on who told the story, which should have been the first warning sign. The man visited her under the pretense of gratitude, bringing groceries, helping with small repairs. It took several visits before she said anything that mattered. And when she did, it was not framed as confession, it was framed as clarification, as though she were correcting a misunderstanding that had lingered too long. She explained that the child's arrival had caused panic, not scandal, at least not in the way people imagined. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no public outrage. The problem was quieter and far more complicated. The parents, she said, were not unknown. They were too well known, entangled with each other in ways that could not be acknowledged without damaging institutions the town depended on. One was already married, the other was tied to a family whose reputation held economic and social weight. A formal adoption would have raised questions. A single household would have drawn attention, but a rotating arrangement, disguised as generosity and necessity, could be normalized. It could be explained away, and most importantly, it could be shared. No one family would carry the full burden of the lie. The woman admitted that she had been the one to say it out loud first, not as a plan, but as a suggestion. "What if he doesn't stay anywhere too long?" she had asked years ago, in a room filled with people who understood the implications immediately. "What if everyone helps?" At the time, it had sounded reasonable, compassionate even, a way to protect the child while protecting everyone else at the same time. What they did not consider, or chose not to, was what such an existence would do to a person over decades. They focused on logistics, not identity, on survival, not belonging. The child was not the priority. Stability was. As the woman spoke, the man realized something that unsettled him more than any missing document ever could. There had been no mastermind, no villain operating in the shadows. The decision had been made by ordinary people, sitting around a table, weighing consequences and choosing the option that minimized immediate damage. The harm had not been intentional. It had been convenient. And convenience, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, not with fear of exposure, but with the strain of holding a truth that had never been properly placed. She had carried it as long as she could, assuming someone else would eventually take responsibility for it. No one ever did. What she did not say, but what the man understood anyway, was that the arrangement had protected more than just reputations. It had protected systems. The church, the school, the local businesses, the families whose names appeared on plaques and donation lists. A formal acknowledgement of the child's origin would have forced a reckoning that extended far beyond two people. It would have exposed patterns of behavior the town preferred to treat as isolated incidents. By dispersing the child across households, they had effectively erased the trail. There was no single point of failure. No single truth-teller who could bring it all down. Everyone knew just enough to stay quiet, and not enough to feel solely responsible. The man left the woman's house with a clarity that felt heavier than ignorance ever had. He now understood why no one had ever answered his questions directly. It wasn't just about protecting the past, it was about protecting the present. Many of the people involved were still alive, still respected, still woven into the town's daily life. Their children held positions of trust. Their grandchildren attended the same schools he once had. To expose the truth now would not simply correct a record. It would destabilize an entire social structure built on selective memory. And yet the truth existed, not as rumor, not as suspicion, but as a series of deliberate choices made by people who believed they were doing the least harmful thing. That night the man reviewed everything he had learned, laying it out in his mind like evidence on a table. The incomplete birth record, the altered files, the church notation, the woman's admission. It formed a coherent narrative for the first time, and in that narrative, the most disturbing element was not the identity of his parents, but the realization that he had been treated as a variable to be managed, not a person to be rooted. The town had not abandoned him. It had absorbed him, and in doing so, it had erased the one thing he had never had the chance to develop, a singular place to belong. What the town did not know yet was that the man had reached a decision of his own, not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of necessity, because the truth, once assembled, does not remain neutral. It demands action, and soon the town would be forced to choose between continuing a lie it had perfected or confronting the cost of having built an entire generation's peace on one child's silence. For most of his life, the man had imagined that if he ever learned the truth about his parents, it would arrive like a revelation, sudden, emotional, undeniable. He expected names to come with shock, perhaps even relief. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, reluctantly, as if even now it resisted being fully known. The town had not erased his parents from memory. It had buried them beneath familiarity. They were not shadows. They were fixtures. And that, he came to understand, was precisely why the truth had been so carefully managed. The first name surfaced not through confession, but through contradiction. While reviewing old school board minutes, documents no one believed would ever be read again, he noticed a recurring signature tied to decisions made during the same years. His living arrangements shifted most dramatically. The timing was too precise to ignore. Every major move in his childhood coincided with changes in oversight, zoning approvals, or funding allocations that kept certain households stable and others flexible. It became clear that someone with influence had been quietly smoothing the logistics, not to control him directly, but to ensure the arrangement remained invisible. The signature belonged to a man who had been publicly admired for decades, a leader, a benefactor, someone whose name was etched into the town's identity. He had been present at town events, church services, graduation ceremonies. He had shaken the man's hand more than once, never lingering, never cold, but never familiar either. The second name was harder to trace, because her erasure had been more complete. Women, especially then, disappeared from records far more easily. Her absence was not suspicious on its own. What raised concern was the pattern of substitutions. Addresses that changed suddenly, employment records that paused and resumed elsewhere, medical files that transferred without explanation. She had not vanished. She had been relocated. Protected, some would say. Managed, others might argue. The man learned that she had spent years living just outside town, close enough to be reachable, far enough to avoid scrutiny. Her name appeared briefly in church donation logs, then stopped. A quiet withdrawal, timed carefully, as if her presence itself posed a risk. When the pieces finally aligned, the truth was unmistakable. His parents were not anonymous victims of circumstance. They were central figures in the town's social fabric, connected in ways that could not be acknowledged without dismantling reputations that many people depended on. Their relationship had not been violent or coercive, at least not in the way scandal narratives often demand. That paradoxically made the situation harder to confront. There was no villain to condemn, no clear moral endpoint. Instead, there were two people whose choices had been quietly absorbed by a community that decided the consequences were too large to face directly. The town had not hidden the parents because it did not know who they were. It had hidden them because it knew exactly who they were. The man struggled with the weight of this realization. He had grown up assuming his lack of permanence was the result of poverty, misfortune, or abandonment. To learn that it was the byproduct of protection extended not to him, but to others, reshaped his understanding of every kindness he had received. The meals, the beds, the careful explanations had not been offered out of love alone. They had been part of a system designed to preserve appearances. He had been safe, yes, but he had also been strategically placed, moved and contained. His existence had been managed like a liability. What made the truth unbearable was not just who his parents were, but who they still were. One remained alive, respected, and publicly untouchable. The other had built a quiet life defined by absence. Her connection to the town reduced to whispers and half-remembered gestures. To name them now would not simply correct a record. It would rewrite decades of history for people who had never consented to be part of the lie, but had nonetheless benefited from it. Teachers who had overlooked missing forms, clergy who had accepted vague explanations, officials who had filed incomplete paperwork without protest. Everyone had played a role, whether they acknowledged it or not. The man considered what justice might look like in this context and found no satisfying answer. Exposure would bring clarity, but also collateral damage. Silence would preserve peace, but at the cost of his own sense of legitimacy. He had lived his entire life without a single document that fully explained who he was. Now, for the first time, he had the names that could complete that story. But speaking them aloud would force the town to confront something it had carefully engineered to avoid. The realization that its stability had been built on the displacement of a child's identity. In the days that followed, subtle changes rippled through the community. Invitations were rescinded. Conversations grew formal. People who had once greeted him warmly now measured their words. They sensed, without being told, that the balance had shifted. The secret was no longer safely distributed. It had been concentrated in one place, inside the man who had lived its consequences. And with that concentration came power. Not the kind that seeks revenge, but the kind that demands acknowledgement. The town could no longer pretend the arrangement had been harmless. It had names now, faces, timelines. The man did not announce his discovery. He did not confront his parents publicly. He waited, because he understood something the town did not yet grasp. The most destabilizing force was not accusation, but inevitability. Records once exposed do not return to hiding. People once named cannot be unnamed. And soon, whether the town liked it or not, the truth would move from private knowledge to public reckoning. Not because he sought to punish, but because a life lived in fragments eventually demands to be made whole. The collapse did not begin with an announcement or a confrontation. There was no dramatic meeting, no accusation spoken aloud in public. The town unraveled the way it had once agreed, quietly, collectively, and without ceremony. A document was requested where none had been requested before. A signature was questioned instead of accepted. A name, once treated as untouchable, was suddenly spoken with caution rather than reverence. People sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if they could not yet articulate what it was. The lie had not been exposed by force. It had simply lost the protection of silence. It began at the county level, where a routine audit flagged inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. The incomplete birth record, once dismissed as an administrative error, now sat alongside corroborating evidence from church archives and school enrollment logs. Together they formed a pattern too precise to be accidental. Officials who had never lived in the town, who owed it no loyalty, began asking questions without understanding why those questions caused such visible discomfort. The town had relied on familiarity to protect itself. Outsiders did not share that instinct. They did not lower their voices or change subjects. They followed procedures. And procedure, when applied consistently, has a way of revealing what intention has concealed. As inquiries expanded, the town's shared understanding fractured. Some people clung to the old logic, insisting that no harm had been done, that the child, now a man, had been cared for, that intentions mattered more than outcomes. Others began to reassess their own memories, realizing that what they had accepted as normal had always felt slightly wrong. The debate did not center on legality or punishment. It centered on responsibility, on whether a community could claim moral credit for survival while denying the cost paid by one of its own. Conversations that had once been unthinkable now took place behind closed doors, in kitchens and hallways, among people who had known each other their entire lives. The parents' names did not appear in headlines. They did not need to. By the time the records were corrected, their identities were already understood by those who mattered. One withdrew from public life quietly, citing health and age. The other remained absent, her role acknowledged only in revised documents and strained conversations. There was no trial, no spectacle. The reckoning was internal, uneven, and unresolved. Some felt relief that the truth was finally aligned with reality. Others felt betrayed, not by the lie itself, but by the realization that they had helped sustain it. The town did what it had always done best. It adjusted. It absorbed the shock and reshaped itself around a new silence, this one framed as closure. For the man at the center of it all, the resolution was not triumphant. Corrected records did not erase decades of displacement. Official acknowledgement did not retroactively grant belonging. What it did offer, finally, was coherence. A single narrative where there had once been fragments, a name attached to an origin, a history that did not require footnotes or evasions. He did not remain in the town long after the process concluded. There was nothing left there for him to reclaim. The place that had raised him had done so without ever truly holding him. Staying would have meant reliving a version of himself that no longer fit. Before he left, he visited the church one last time, not to confront anyone, not to demand apologies. He sat quietly in the back, listening to familiar hymns, watching faces that had once felt like home. He realized then that the town's greatest fear had never been exposure. It had been reflection, the understanding that ordinary people acting together could create something harmful without malice, simply by choosing comfort over clarity. The child had been raised, yes, but he had also been diluted, his identity spread thin, so no one had to carry it fully. The town would continue, new families would arrive, old ones would fade. The story would be told in softened terms if it was told at all, but something essential had changed. The corrected record existed now, unerasable, a quiet reminder that stability built on shared denial is never neutral. It always has a cost, and that cost is often paid by those least able to object at the time. The man left without anger, but not without resolve. He carried with him the knowledge that truth does not always arrive to punish. Sometimes it arrives simply to be acknowledged, to restore proportion, to give shape to a life that had been lived without a clear beginning. He did not see himself as a victim, nor did he see the town as cruel. He saw it as human, capable of care, capable of harm, and capable of choosing silence when silence felt safer than honesty. And that, in the end, was the scandal the town could never fully erase. Not the names, not the records, but the realization that an entire community had agreed, quietly and collectively, to raise a child without ever allowing him to belong.